The building was always quiet at night, and that was how Daniel liked it. When everyone had gone home, the office floor felt like another world. Soft hums from the vending machines, the distant buzz of ceiling lights, and the rhythmic squeak of his cleaning cart's wheels. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. He liked that. Every swipe of the mop, every polished surface was something he could take pride in. He wasn't the type to complain. He just did what needed to be done. Daniel had been working as a custodian at the corporate headquarters for almost 4 years. The pay wasn't great, but it kept the lights on at home and food on the table for his daughter, Lily. She was 16 and the center of his world. Everything he did was for her. Every late night, every double shift, it was all so she could have a better chance at life than he did. Most people at the office barely noticed him during the day. They passed by in their suits, talking on phones, carrying coffee cups that cost more than Daniel's lunch. He didn't mind. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to keep his head down and get through the day. But there were a few who smiled when they saw him. The security guard at the front desk, the receptionist who sometimes left him cookies, and the night maintenance crew who shared stories about their families during breaks. Those were the small moments that made the long nights feel less lonely. Every evening after finishing his first round of cleaning, Daniel liked to stop by the lobby for a minute. It was the grandest part of the building. Shiny marble floors, tall glass windows, and a large black piano standing near the entrance. It was there mostly for decoration, covered in a soft layer of dust most days. Sometimes visiting executives played it during events, but most of the time it sat in silence. Daniel had a quiet habit of wiping the piano every few nights. Not because it was dirty, but because he liked being near it. He never told anyone, but he used to play. A long time ago, before life took its turns, he studied music in college. He dreamed of being a pianist, performing in halls filled with people, teaching someday, maybe even composing his own music. But then his wife got sick and everything changed. School had to wait. The dreams had to wait. And when she passed away, Daniel found himself alone with a little girl to raise and bills that never seemed to stop. He hadn't touched a piano in years. Not really. Sometimes when no one was around, his fingers would hover above the keys just to remember how they felt. Smooth, cool, waiting. He never dared to press them down. It didn't feel right somehow, as if the music belonged to another life. But even so, when he cleaned the lobby, he often caught himself humming softly. Little fragments of melodies came to him, like ghosts of old songs that never left his memory. It helped him get through the nights. It reminded him that even if he didn't have much, he still carried something beautiful inside him. At home, life was simple, but full of love. Their small apartment wasn't fancy, but it was warm. Lily always waited up for him, no matter how late he came home. They'd sit together at the kitchen table, eating leftovers and talking about her day. She loved art and wanted to be a designer someday. Daniel always encouraged her. "You chase your dream, kiddo," he'd tell her. "Don't ever let life talk you out of it." Sometimes when she asked about his music days, Daniel smiled and shrugged. That was a long time ago, he'd say. But she could tell it still meant something to him. She once saved up her own allowance to buy him a small keyboard from a yard sale. It was missing a few keys and made a strange buzzing sound when plugged in, but Daniel still set it up in the corner of their living room. He didn't play it often, but every time he walked past it, he felt something stir inside. One night, as he was mopping near the piano in the lobby, one of the younger employees walked by, a man in his 20s, dressed sharp, always joking around. "Hey, Dan," he said with a grin. "You ever play that thing or just polish it for us?" Daniel chuckled quietly. "Just keeping it clean," he said. "You look like the type who could surprise us," the man teased. "Maybe you've got some hidden talent." "Not much talent left in these hands," Daniel replied, showing his rough, calloused fingers. The young man laughed and walked off. It was all in good fun. Daniel didn't take it to heart. People often joked with him like that. He knew most of them didn't mean any harm. Still, after the man left, Daniel sat down on the piano bench for a moment. He looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then he placed his fingers lightly on the keys. He didn't play, just rested them there. He could almost feel the notes waiting for him. A small smile crossed his face before he stood up again and got back to work. He didn't want to be caught sitting around. People might think he was wasting time. His nights were long, but he didn't complain. The company was decent to him. The managers treated him kindly, and the building was always safe. Sometimes, though, he wondered if this was all life had left for him, cleaning up after others, keeping things neat and shiny while his own dreams gathered dust somewhere deep inside. Then he'd think of Lily, and that thought alone was enough to keep him going. She was his reason, his purpose. There were moments, especially late at night when the building was empty, when Daniel would walk past the tall windows and see his reflection staring back. The tired eyes, the worn-out uniform, the faint streaks of gray in his hair. It was strange to think that the young man who once played music with passion and fire was now pushing a mop. But even so, he didn't feel bitter. Life had taken a turn, yes, but he was still standing. And in his heart he carried the memory of music like a secret flame that refused to go out. One Friday evening, as he was finishing up, he noticed the HR team setting up decorations in the lobby. Balloons, banners, and catering tables. He asked what was going on, and one of them said, "Big company event tomorrow. Everyone's coming in. Managers, executives, even the CEO. It's going to be fancy." Daniel nodded. He knew he'd have to come in early to make sure everything stayed spotless. He didn't mind. Events like that always left a mess, but the overtime pay helped with Lily's school expenses. That night, when he went home, Lily was working on a poster project for school. She asked him about his day, and he told her about the event. "They're having it in the lobby," he said. "They even brought in a big grand piano for decoration." "Wow," Lily said. "Do you think anyone's going to play it?" He smiled faintly. "Probably not. People these days like music that comes from speakers, not from hands." She looked up at him thoughtfully. "You could play it," Daniel laughed. "I think they'd fire me before I finished the first note." "I'm serious," she said. "You should. You're good, Dad, I've heard you. You still have it." He shook his head but couldn't help feeling a little warmth inside. "Maybe in another life," he said softly. That night, after Lily went to bed, Daniel sat in the living room with the old keyboard she'd bought him. The room was quiet except for the sound of the fridge humming. He turned on the keyboard, and the familiar buzzing sound filled the air. Slowly, he pressed a few keys. The sound was uneven, a bit off, but the melody came back to him like it had been waiting all this time. His hands remembered even if his heart had forgotten. He played a soft tune, something simple and tender. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to remind him of who he used to be. When he finished, he looked over at the photo of his wife on the shelf. She was smiling in that picture, holding Lily as a baby. "You'd laugh if you saw me now," he whispered. "But I'm doing my best." The next day he went to work early. The building was buzzing with excitement for the big event. People were setting up lights and sound equipment. The air smelled of coffee and pastries. Daniel moved quietly through the crowd, cleaning, making sure everything looked perfect. No one paid much attention to him, but he didn't mind. He liked watching people prepare, seeing their laughter and energy. It reminded him of concerts from long ago when the audience would murmur before the first note began. As he passed by the piano, he couldn't resist touching it once more, just one finger brushing across the keys. It made a single note, bright and clear, echoing faintly through the lobby. A few people nearby turned their heads, surprised. Daniel quickly smiled, pretending it was an accident, and went back to pushing his cart. But deep inside, something had awakened. Something small, fragile, but alive. He didn't know it yet, but the piano would soon become the reason people in that building would never forget his name. Saturday morning came early for Daniel. The sun was barely up when he left the apartment, carrying his lunch bag and a small thermos of coffee. The streets were still quiet, the air cool and calm. He liked walking to work at that hour. It gave him a few minutes to think, to clear his head before the day began. The city always felt softer at dawn, like it was still half asleep. When he reached the tall glass building, the front doors were already open, and a few employees were moving around inside, setting up the final details for the big company event. Banners hung from the ceiling that read, "Employee Appreciation Day," and a stage was being built near the center of the lobby. The grand piano had been moved to one side of the stage, its polished surface gleaming under the lights. Daniel signed in at the front desk and nodded to the security guard, who gave him a friendly wave. He pushed his cart toward the storage room, changed into his uniform, and began checking his list of cleaning duties for the day. It was going to be a long one. Trash bins, restrooms, lobby floors, and then staying after the event to clean up. He was used to it by now. By 8 o'clock, the building was full of people. Employees arrived in their best clothes, laughing, taking pictures, chatting excitedly about the day ahead. Tables of food lined the walls, sandwiches, pastries, fruit, and coffee that smelled rich and sweet. Music played softly from speakers hidden somewhere in the ceiling. Daniel moved quietly among them, keeping things tidy. He wiped tables, refilled napkin dispensers, and made sure the floors stayed spotless despite the traffic. Every now and then someone thanked him as he passed, and he'd nod with a small smile. Around mid-morning, the company's HR director, a cheerful woman named Clara, came up to him holding a clipboard. "Hey, Daniel," she said kindly. "Can you check the piano area? The CEO wants it spotless before the ceremony starts." "Of course," Daniel said, already heading in that direction. He took a clean cloth and gently wiped the piano's glossy surface, careful not to leave streaks. The piano was a beautiful piece, deep black with ivory keys that looked as if they'd never been touched. He leaned in slightly, noticing a small smudge near the corner, and polished it away until the surface shone like a mirror. For a second, he caught his reflection in it, his tired eyes, his worn uniform, his calm expression. He wondered if anyone could tell that he once belonged to this instrument, even if only in another lifetime. By noon, the event was in full swing. People were mingling, laughing, taking photos near the banners. The CEO arrived with a small group of executives, shaking hands and greeting everyone with practiced warmth. Daniel stood at the edge of the room watching from a distance while pretending to check the trash bins. He liked seeing people happy. It gave the place life. Then, during a lull in the chatter, someone's voice cut through the crowd. "Hey, we've got this piano sitting here and no one's using it." It was the same young man who'd teased Daniel before, the one who worked in marketing. He grinned, looking around. "Anybody here play?" A few chuckles rippled through the room. People shrugged, shook their heads, or mumbled something about being rusty. The man walked up to the piano and pressed a few random keys, making a messy sound that made everyone laugh. "Come on," he said, looking around with mock drama. "There's got to be someone in this whole building who knows how to play at least one song." Someone from the crowd called out jokingly, "Ask the janitor. He's always cleaning that thing." The crowd laughed again, lightheartedly, not meaning any harm. But suddenly all eyes turned toward Daniel, who was standing a few steps away, holding his mop. He felt his face warm. He smiled awkwardly and shook his head. "Oh, come on, Daniel," the young man said, grinning. "You've been polishing it for years. You must know how it works." Daniel chuckled softly. "I don't think anyone wants to hear me play," he said. But the teasing continued, this time mixed with friendly encouragement. "Let him try," someone said. "Why not? It's all in good fun." The crowd started clapping lightly, cheering him on. Daniel hesitated. He didn't like attention, and he certainly didn't want to make a fool of himself in front of all these people. But at the same time, something inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time. He looked toward the piano again. It gleamed under the lights, waiting. The same keys he'd avoided for years now seemed to be calling to him. "All right," he said finally, his voice calm but quiet. "Just for a moment." The room cheered, playful and curious. A few people stepped back to make space as Daniel slowly walked toward the piano. He set down his mop, wiped his hands on a napkin, and took a deep breath. Then he sat down on the bench. His back was straight, his hands resting gently on his knees. "Let's see what you've got, Daniel," someone shouted from the back. He smiled a little but didn't look up. His fingers hovered above the keys. The laughter around him faded into a soft murmur. For a moment he didn't move. It was as if the world held its breath. Then he touched the keys, lightly, carefully, and began to play. The first few notes were simple, almost hesitant, like a whisper. But within seconds something shifted. His hands found their rhythm, his shoulders relaxed, and the sound grew fuller, smoother. The notes danced through the lobby, filling the space with something warm and real. Conversation stopped. The laughter quieted. The crowd slowly turned toward him, eyes widening as the melody unfolded. Daniel's fingers moved gracefully, almost effortlessly. He wasn't playing from a sheet of music, he was playing from memory, from feeling. It was a tune he hadn't touched in years, but it came back as naturally as breathing. The melody told a story, one of loss, love, and hope. Each note carried emotion, as if every moment of his life had been poured into the keys. People began to gather closer. The joking expressions faded, replaced by awe. Even the young man who'd teased him stood silent now, his grin gone, replaced by something else. Respect. Daniel's world disappeared as he played. He wasn't in a shiny office building anymore. He was back in a small, warm room with a piano that once belonged to his wife, her laughter echoing in the background, his daughter humming along as a little girl. The memories wrapped around him like a blanket. He felt alive again, like the part of him that had been buried under years of work and worry had finally risen to breathe. When the song reached its final note, Daniel let his hands rest on the keys. The sound lingered in the air before fading into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The room was completely still. Then the applause came. Soft at first, then louder until the entire lobby filled with the sound of clapping. Some people were smiling. Others were wiping their eyes. Daniel looked up, a little dazed, and smiled shyly. He stood and gave a small nod. "Guess it still works," he said with a quiet laugh. The crowd laughed gently with him, but it wasn't the same kind of laughter as before. It was full of admiration. A woman near the front said softly, "That was beautiful." Daniel thanked her and started to step away, but before he could, he noticed someone standing a few feet away, the CEO. A tall man in a dark suit, arms crossed, watching him closely. The applause faded as the CEO walked forward. "That was unexpected," the CEO said, his voice calm but warm. "You play beautifully." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Thank you, sir. It's been a long time." The CEO nodded slowly. "Well, I'm glad we got to hear it today." The crowd started to talk again, buzzing with excitement, replaying the moment to each other. Daniel quietly picked up his mop and returned to work, his heart still racing. He didn't feel embarrassed anymore. He felt lighter, as if something locked inside him had finally been freed. Later, when the event ended and people were heading home, Daniel stayed behind to clean up. The decorations came down, the food trays were packed away, and the music from the speakers stopped. The building grew quiet again. The only sound was the gentle hum of the lights and the faint echo of his own footsteps. Before leaving, he walked back to the piano. He ran a finger along the edge of the keys, smiling to himself. For the first time in years, he didn't just see a piece of furniture collecting dust. He saw a friend waiting for him to return, and deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of that story. Something had begun that day. Something he didn't fully understand yet, but it made his heart feel alive again. And that was enough. Daniel's fingers rested on the cool ivory keys, and the sound of laughter slowly disappeared. The room, which had been buzzing with chatter and jokes only moments ago, now seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on him, but Daniel didn't look at anyone. He just stared down at the piano, his mind suddenly full of memories. His wife's smile, his daughter's laughter, and the faint echo of the melodies he once played for them in a small, sunlit apartment. He pressed a single key. A soft note filled the space. It was simple, almost uncertain, but it was enough to break the tension. Then another note followed, and another. Soon his hands began to move on their own. The rhythm found him, not the other way around. The years melted away with each sound, and the building around him faded until all that existed were his hands and the piano. At first, the people nearby smiled politely, thinking he was just going to play a few awkward chords. But then something changed. The notes grew richer, smoother, more emotional. They rose and fell like waves, gentle at first, then powerful and deep. The melody carried a kind of sadness, but also peace. It was as if the music itself was telling a story too personal for words. The young man who had teased him stood frozen, the smile gone from his face. People started turning their heads, whispering softly, unsure how to react. Even the CEO, who had been talking with an executive near the back, stopped mid-sentence and turned to watch. Daniel's body moved naturally with the music. His shoulders rose and fell with each phrase, his fingers gliding effortlessly from one note to the next. He played as though he were talking to someone who wasn't there, someone who once listened to every piece he wrote. For him, this wasn't a performance. It was a memory, a confession, a way to speak without words. As the melody flowed, the room grew completely silent. No one moved. The hum of the lights, the air conditioning, everything seemed to fade beneath the sound of that piano. People who had never spoken to Daniel before now watched him with wide eyes, their expressions softening with each passing note. One woman near the front pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the music more than hearing it. Another worker wiped away a tear she didn't expect to shed. Even the CEO, known for his calm, composed nature, stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the man in the janitor's uniform who was somehow making the room feel like a concert hall. Daniel didn't notice any of it. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for his wife, who used to sit beside him as he practiced late at night. He was playing for his daughter, who once danced barefoot in the living room while he played lullabies to make her laugh. Every note carried love, loss, and longing. And yet underneath it all there was hope. There was beauty. There was life. The music grew softer now, delicate like a whisper. It felt like the end of a story, the kind that leaves you quiet not because it's sad but because it's true. His fingers slowed, the final note hanging in the air long after it was played. Then silence. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The room was so still that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting the stunned faces around him. He gave a small, nervous smile, unsure what to do. Then from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. One person, then another, until the entire room erupted in applause. The sound filled the lobby, echoing off the walls. People were cheering, some even whistling, but Daniel just sat there, blinking in disbelief. He hadn't expected that reaction. He just wanted to play one song to remember. But now the crowd was on its feet, clapping and smiling at him as if he'd just given them something priceless. He stood up slowly and nodded, his cheeks slightly red. "Thank you," he said softly, almost embarrassed. That's enough for me." But the applause only grew louder. People were moved not just by his music, but by the story they could feel behind it. The quiet man who had been sweeping floors for years had just reminded them what real beauty sounded like. The CEO walked forward through the crowd, his expression unreadable at first. When he reached Daniel, he extended his hand. "That was incredible," he said, his voice low but sincere. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "I used to study music," he said. "A long time ago. You used to?" the CEO asked. Daniel nodded. "My wife got sick and I had to stop. Life got busy and I never went back." The CEO looked at him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Well," he said, "it seems like you never really stopped." Daniel gave a modest shrug. "I just remember what it felt like." The CEO placed a hand on his shoulder. "You reminded all of us what it feels like," he said quietly. People gathered around, congratulating him, asking questions, thanking him for playing. Someone even joked that he should perform at the next company event. Daniel laughed, still trying to process everything. He didn't know how to handle so much attention. All he knew was that his heart felt lighter than it had in years. When the crowd began to thin and people returned to their conversations, Daniel sat back down at the piano bench for a moment, alone again. He ran his hand across the keys, still warm from his playing. For the first time in a long while, he felt peace, not just pride, but something deeper. A connection to the part of himself he thought was gone forever. Later that day, after the event ended and most employees had left, Daniel stayed behind to clean up. The decorations were half taken down and paper cups littered the tables. But he didn't mind. His body was tired, but his spirit wasn't. As he worked, a few employees who were still packing up came over to thank him again. One woman said softly, "You made me remember my father. He used to play like that. It was beautiful." He nodded and smiled, humbled by her words. By the time the building emptied, the only people left were Daniel and the night security guard. The guard leaned on his desk and said, "Didn't know we had a hidden star in the building." Daniel laughed gently. "I think star might be a stretch." The guard smiled. "You should have seen their faces. You gave them something they'll talk about for weeks." When Daniel finally clocked out and stepped outside, the sky was painted orange and purple from the setting sun. The cool air brushed his face and he breathed it in deeply. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly against the pavement. For once he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, not for what he did, but for who he was. That night when he got home, Lily was waiting up for him as usual. She had her sketchbook open, doodling under the warm light of their kitchen lamp. "You're late," she said, smiling. "How was the event?" Daniel hung his jacket on the chair and sat down. He wasn't sure how to explain everything that had happened. "It was something special," he said at last. "Yeah?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "What happened?" He smiled, remembering the moment, the sound of applause, the looks on people's faces. I played the piano, he said. Lily's eyes widened. You what? At work? He nodded. They asked me to, kind of as a joke. But I played anyway, and? She said, leaning forward eagerly. They listened, he said simply. Really listened. Lily broke into a wide grin. I knew you still had it. I told you. Daniel chuckled softly. Maybe you were right. She got up and hugged him tightly. I'm proud of you, Dad. He hugged her back, holding her a little longer than usual. Thanks, kiddo, he whispered. You know, I think maybe music's not done with me yet. As the night grew quiet and the world outside went still, Daniel sat at the old keyboard in the corner of their living room. It buzzed just like always, a few keys still broken, but he didn't mind. He started to play softly and Lily sat nearby, sketching while listening. It wasn't a concert hall or a fancy lobby, but it felt right. It felt like home, and somewhere deep inside, Daniel knew that what had happened that day was just the beginning of something he couldn't quite see yet, but could already feel. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. He didn't know why, but something about the night before still lingered in his chest. His daughter was still asleep, curled up under her blanket, and the apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the heater. He sat at the edge of his bed, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them, even though it wasn't cold. He could still feel the smooth keys of the piano beneath his fingers, the way the room had gone silent, the way every note seemed to hang in the air like it meant something. When he closed his eyes, he could see the crowd again, the surprise in their faces, the way they looked at him differently. He wasn't used to that. For years he had been invisible, moving quietly through hallways, cleaning up after people who never even noticed him. But last night, for a few brief minutes, they had listened to him. Really listened. It didn't make sense, but it felt like he had been seen for the first time in a long while. He smiled faintly to himself before getting ready for work. There was no time to dwell on it. The event had left the building a mess, and he knew he had another long day ahead of him. He poured some coffee into his thermos, packed a sandwich, and stepped out into the early morning air. When he reached the building, it was quieter than usual. Most of the employees had the day off after the big event. Only a few people were there, mostly the staff cleaning up or putting things back in order. Daniel clocked in, grabbed his cart, and went straight to work. The banners were half taken down. The floor was sticky from spilled drinks, and a few decorations still hung crookedly on the walls. It was the kind of mess he knew well. As he worked, a few employees who had stayed behind to help smiled at him and nodded. One of them even said, "Hey, you were amazing yesterday." Daniel just smiled modestly and said, "Thank you." He wasn't used to compliments. He didn't know what to say beyond that. A few hours later, while he was mopping near the lobby, he noticed someone standing near the piano. It was the CEO. He was dressed in a crisp gray suit, his jacket off, sleeves rolled up. He wasn't surrounded by assistants or managers this time. He was alone, looking down at the piano like he was thinking about something. Daniel paused, unsure if he should interrupt. He was about to quietly back away when the CEO turned and noticed him. "Good morning, Daniel," the CEO said, smiling politely. "Morning, sir," Daniel replied. "I was just finishing up here." The CEO nodded and gestured toward the piano. "You played beautifully yesterday. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." Daniel felt his face warm. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." "I'm serious," the CEO said. "I've been coming to this building for years, and I've heard live bands, guest performers, even professionals at events. But what you played, it was different. It had soul." Daniel looked down, not sure what to say. "I just played what I remembered," he said softly. "It's been a long time since I've touched a piano." The CEO tilted his head. "Where did you learn?" Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially to someone like the CEO. But there was something kind in the man's tone, something that didn't feel like small talk. "I studied music when I was younger," Daniel said. "I thought that was going to be my life. But my wife got sick and I had to stop. After she passed, I just never went back. I had my daughter to take care of. Music didn't fit into the picture anymore." The CEO listened quietly. For a moment, the big lobby didn't feel like a workplace. It felt like two men standing in the same quiet, both understanding something unspoken. Finally, the CEO said, "Life has a way of putting dreams on pause, doesn't it?" Daniel smiled faintly. Yeah, but I guess some things never really leave you. The CEO nodded. I think you're right. They stood there in silence for a while. The CEO reached out and pressed one of the piano keys lightly. The note echoed through the lobby. You know, he said, I saw people crying yesterday. Real tears. You moved them. I didn't mean to, Daniel said, almost embarrassed. I just wanted to play something honest. That's exactly why it worked, the CEO said. There's honesty in what you do, both in your work and in your music. Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments like that didn't come his way often. He just nodded, grateful but still a little stunned. Then, to his surprise, the CEO said, Would you mind coming by my office later today? I'd like to talk about something. Daniel blinked. Me, sir? Yes, you, the CEO said with a small grin. Nothing bad, I promise. Just come by when you're done here. All right, Daniel said slowly. I'll be there. The CEO patted him on the shoulder before walking away. Good. I'll see you then. When the man disappeared down the hallway, Daniel just stood there for a moment staring at the piano. He couldn't help but chuckle softly. What on earth could he want to talk about? He murmured to himself. He shook his head and got back to work, though his thoughts were anything but calm. Hours later, when his shift was nearly done, Daniel washed his hands, straightened his uniform, and made his way to the top floor. The elevator ride felt unusually long. He wasn't used to being up there. The carpet was thicker, the walls decorated with framed art, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. He knocked gently on the door labeled Executive Office. Come in, came the familiar voice. Daniel stepped inside. The CEO was sitting behind his desk, but he stood when Daniel entered. Daniel, glad you came. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, Daniel said. Not at all, the CEO replied. Please sit. Daniel sat carefully in one of the leather chairs, unsure where to rest his hands. He felt completely out of place among the glass shelves and expensive furniture. The CEO, noticing his nervousness, smiled warmly. Relax, he said. This isn't about work performance or anything like that. Daniel nodded. All right. The CEO leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. I wanted to ask you something personal. Have you ever thought about teaching? Music, I mean. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. Teaching? He repeated. No, sir. I wouldn't even know where to start. The CEO smiled. I think you'd be great at it. The company's been running a community program for a few years now. Music lessons for kids from low-income families. We fund the instruments and bring in instructors. The problem is we've been short on teachers. I thought maybe you might want to help. Daniel stared at him, speechless. You want me to teach? Yes, the CEO said. Not full-time, of course. You could still keep your custodial position if you'd like, but we'd pay you for the lessons too. You have a gift, Daniel. It's too good to stay hidden. Daniel leaned back slightly, trying to process everything. No one had ever offered him something like that before. He felt his chest tighten with emotion, though he tried to keep his composure. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Say yes, the CEO said gently. You'd be doing something meaningful, not just for yourself, but for those kids. You'd be giving them something real. Daniel swallowed hard, looking down at his calloused hands, the same hands that had cleaned floors and emptied trash cans for years. Now somehow they were being asked to make music again. He thought of his daughter, of how proud she'd be. Slowly he looked up and smiled. All right, he said softly. I'll do it. The CEO's smile widened. I'm glad to hear that. We'll take care of the details later. For now, just know that you've inspired a lot of people around here, Daniel, including me. Daniel stood, shaking the CEO's hand firmly. Thank you, sir, he said. I don't think I'll ever forget this. Neither will I, the CEO replied. As Daniel left the office, he felt lighter than he had in years. When he stepped back into the elevator, he let out a quiet laugh, half disbelief, half joy. Life had never been easy for him, but for the first time, it felt like it was finally giving something back. That evening, when he got home, his daughter noticed the glow in his face before he said a word. What happened, Dad? She asked with a grin. He smiled, setting down his bag. I think I just got a second chance. The next few weeks passed like a quiet dream for Daniel. Life still moved in its usual rhythm. He worked his shifts, took care of his daughter, and made sure everything stayed in order. But something inside him had changed. It wasn't a big, showy change. It was something gentle, steady, like a new light shining from a corner of his life that had been dark for too long. True to his word, the CEO followed up on their conversation. One morning, the HR director called Daniel into her office with a warm smile. She handed him a folder full of papers. "These are the details for the community program," she said. "You'll be teaching piano twice a week after your regular shift. The company will cover the costs, and the classes will be held at the local youth center." Daniel blinked, still a bit overwhelmed. "They really want me to do this?" he asked. "They do," she said with a grin. "You made quite an impression. Everyone's still talking about that day." He chuckled softly. "I didn't think it was such a big deal." "Well, it was," she said. "You reminded people what heart looks like. And the CEO, he believes you can make a difference." Daniel held the papers carefully as if they were fragile. "I'll do my best," he said quietly. That evening, he went home and told his daughter everything. Her eyes lit up like stars. "Dad, that's amazing," she said. "You're going to be a teacher." "You deserve this," he smiled, watching her excitement. "It's just a few lessons," he said modestly. "Still," she insisted, "it's something real. It's music. You've always said that when you play, you feel alive." He nodded. "I do. Maybe it's time to feel that again." When the first day of the class came, Daniel felt nervous in a way he hadn't felt in years. The youth center was small but full of energy. Children running around, laughing, playing basketball in the back, the smell of crayons and old wood filling the air. He arrived early, carrying a small binder of notes and a gentle smile that hid his nerves. The piano in the corner was slightly worn, some of the keys yellowed with age, but it was beautiful to him. He ran his hand across it like an old friend. Soon a group of 6 kids came in, their eyes full of curiosity. They were from different backgrounds, some shy, some bursting with energy. "Hi, I'm Daniel," he said warmly. "I'll be helping you learn piano. Has anyone here played before?" A few shook their heads. One boy raised his hand and said, "My grandma has one at her house, but she says I bang on it too loud." Everyone laughed, including Daniel. "That's okay," he said kindly. "Sometimes the best songs start with noise." The first lesson was simple: how to sit, how to find middle C, how to listen before pressing a key. But Daniel didn't just teach them notes. He told them stories about how every song is a feeling turned into sound, about how patience makes music come alive. The kids listened closely, their little fingers clumsy but eager. When class ended, one of the smallest girls lingered behind. "Mr. Daniel," she said softly, "my mom says we can't afford lessons like this. So thank you," he smiled, touched. "You don't owe me thanks," he said gently. "Just promise me you'll keep playing." She nodded with determination. "I will." Walking home that night, Daniel felt something deep inside, something he hadn't felt since before his wife got sick. Purpose. He was doing something that mattered again, something that filled him instead of just tiring him out. Back at the office, things changed too. People who had never spoken to him before now stopped to chat. Some asked him about the classes, others about music. The young man who'd once teased him even apologized one day in the break room. "Hey man," he said awkwardly. "About that day, I didn't mean to make fun. You were incredible." Daniel smiled easily. "It's all right," he said. "If you hadn't said something, I probably wouldn't have played." "Guess we both learned something," the man said, grinning. The story of Daniel's piano moment spread through the company. Someone had filmed part of it on their phone, and before long it was shared on social media. Thousands of people watched it, some leaving comments about how it reminded them of their own parents or teachers. Others said it gave them hope. Daniel didn't pay much attention to the online side of it, but his daughter showed him once. "Dad, people love you," she said proudly. "You're kind of famous," he laughed, shaking his head. "I think they just liked the song." But fame wasn't what mattered to him. What mattered was how the world around him felt warmer. The CEO stopped by the youth center one evening to see the class. He stood quietly in the back, watching as the children played a simple tune together. When the song ended, he clapped softly and smiled. After class, he said, "You've done something special here, Daniel. Look at their faces." Daniel looked at the children who were laughing and teasing each other about who hit the wrong key. He smiled. "They remind me why music matters," he said. "It's not about being perfect, it's about feeling something." The CEO nodded. "That's exactly right." As months passed, the program grew. More kids joined. The youth center even received donations for new instruments, partly because of Daniel's story. People wanted to help. They wanted to be part of something good. Every time he sat at the piano surrounded by those children, Daniel felt like he was rebuilding the life he'd lost, one note at a time. At home, his daughter was thriving too. Her grades were up, her art was improving, and she started volunteering at the youth center on weekends. One night she said, "You know, Dad, when you play, it's like everything feels okay. I want to do that for people someday with art." He smiled proudly. "Then you will. You already have that heart." One evening, near the end of the school year, the youth center hosted a small recital. The children were nervous, dressed in their best clothes, fidgeting on the small stage as parents filled the seats. Daniel sat at the side, his hands folded, watching them with quiet pride. When the first student began to play, his heart swelled. The notes weren't perfect, some were missed, others off tempo, but they were played with love. Each child had found a little bit of confidence, a little bit of music inside themselves. By the end of the night, when the applause filled the small hall, Daniel's eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. After the show, the CEO came up to him again, shaking his hand firmly. "You did it," he said. Daniel smiled through the emotion. "They did it," he said. "I just helped them find the music." The CEO laughed softly. "You're too humble, Daniel. You know, I think everyone who's met you has learned something." Daniel tilted his head. "What's that?" "That real success isn't about titles or offices. It's about heart." Daniel looked at him for a moment and nodded. "I think you're right." As the night ended and the lights dimmed, Daniel stayed behind to help clean up like he always did. But this time, when he sat down at the piano one last time, he wasn't alone. His daughter sat beside him. "Play something," she said. He smiled. "What should I play?" "Play what you played that night at work," she said. "The one that made everyone quiet." He nodded, placing his fingers on the keys. The melody came easily, flowing through the room. His daughter closed her eyes, resting her head on his shoulder as he played. The music filled the air like a memory, warm and alive. When the final note faded, she whispered, "Mom would have loved that." Daniel's eyes softened. "I think she heard it," he said quietly. They sat there for a while, not saying much. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the windows. Life wasn't perfect. There were still bills, still long nights. But Daniel felt something he hadn't in years. Peace, gratitude, hope. He had started as a man who cleaned floors in silence. Now he was a man who filled rooms with music again, a father his daughter could look up to, a teacher who reminded others that even in the quiet corners of life, beauty can still be found. And deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of his second chance. Time has a way of turning small moments into memories that never fade. For Daniel, the months that followed the recital felt like living inside one of his own songs, gentle, full of emotion, sometimes bittersweet, but always moving forward. Life hadn't suddenly become easy, but it had become meaningful again. The piano lessons at the youth center continued to grow. Word spread quickly about the kind man who taught children not just how to play music, but how to feel it. Parents came to watch, and even people from the company volunteered to help. Some donated instruments, others painted the classroom walls or built new benches. It wasn't just a class anymore, it was a community. Every time Daniel sat down at the piano, he saw hope in the children's eyes. Some came from broken homes, others struggled in school. But for that 1 hour each week, they belonged somewhere. They had a voice, even if it came out through clumsy fingers and shaky notes. Daniel often thought of himself when he looked at them, of all the times he had almost given up, all the nights he'd sat in silence wishing for something more. Now he was giving that something more to others. One evening after class, the CEO came to visit again. He brought along a few board members who had heard about the program. The kids were excited, showing off their progress, playing small duets and laughing when they hit the wrong notes. The CEO stood quietly at the back, watching with that same expression he'd worn the day Daniel first played in front of him, a mix of pride and wonder. When the class ended, the CEO approached Daniel. "You've done more than we ever imagined," he said softly. "Do you realize how many lives you've touched?" Daniel smiled, wiping the chalk dust from his hands. "I'm just teaching music," he said humbly. The CEO shook his head. "No, you're teaching people to believe in themselves again. That's something even money can't buy." They both stood in silence for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the old piano in the background. Then the CEO said, "I've been thinking about expanding this program, turning it into something bigger, a foundation maybe, and I want you to lead it." Daniel froze. Me, lead it? He almost laughed at the thought. "Sir, I don't have the experience for that. I'm just a custodian who teaches a few kids how to play." The CEO's voice was calm but firm. "You're more than that. You're the reason this exists. People follow heart, Daniel, not titles. You've shown what that means." Daniel didn't know what to say. The idea scared him, but it also filled him with something powerful, a sense that maybe his life could grow beyond what he'd ever imagined. He promised to think about it. That night he sat at the kitchen table long after his daughter went to bed. The old lamp flickered as he stared at the blank paper in front of him. He thought about all the years he had spent cleaning floors, all the nights he'd tucked his little girl into bed while wondering if he was doing enough. Now suddenly people saw him as someone who could lead, someone who could make a difference. He glanced at the small photograph of his late wife on the shelf. "You'd laugh if you could see me now," he whispered with a faint smile. "But I think you'd be proud too." The next morning he told the CEO yes. Months passed and the foundation took shape. The company offered full support, donating money and connecting Daniel with local schools. Soon there were music programs in several neighborhoods, each one with a piano, each one teaching children who'd never touched an instrument before. Daniel visited every site, meeting families, shaking hands, and encouraging teachers. He never lost his humility. He still worked part-time at the building, still talked to everyone with the same quiet kindness. He often said, "Music doesn't need fancy words, it just needs heart." That's all. His daughter helped design the logo for the foundation, a small piano key shaped like a heart. It was perfect. On opening day, she stood beside him, proudly wearing a t-shirt with that logo printed across it. The local newspaper wrote an article about him titled, "The Custodian Who Changed the Tune." Daniel laughed when he read it. "I guess they like their headlines," he said. The CEO attended every major event.
He often introduced Daniel by saying, "This man reminded us that talent can be found in the most unexpected places."
Sometimes all it takes is a little courage and one honest song. Life slowly found a beautiful balance. Daniel's days were busy but full. His daughter grew older, more independent, but she still came to his classes sometimes, sketching while he played. They didn't have much money, but they had something stronger, peace and a sense of pride that couldn't be bought. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Daniel stayed behind at the youth center to lock up. The kids had gone home, the lights were dim, and the air was filled with the faint echo of laughter and music. He sat down at the piano one last time, his fingers resting gently on the keys. He began to play the same melody he had played that night at the company party, the one that started it all. The song flowed easily now, no hesitation, no fear. It was still the same tune, but it felt different. It wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by it. As the final note faded, he heard clapping behind him. He turned and saw the CEO standing by the door, smiling warmly. "I thought you'd gone home," Daniel said with a small laugh. "I was just leaving," the CEO said, "but I wanted to hear you play one more time." Daniel looked back at the piano. "This song always feels like home," he said. "It is," the CEO replied. "It's the song that built all this." They both stood there for a while, not speaking. Then the CEO said, "You know, Daniel, that night when I first heard you play, I was going through a hard time myself. I didn't tell anyone, but I was thinking of stepping down. I felt disconnected. Then you played that song and something changed. You reminded me why I started all this in the first place. You gave me back my purpose." Daniel turned to him, quietly surprised. "I didn't know that," the CEO nodded. "Most people don't, but I wanted you to know. You didn't just change the lives of those kids, you changed mine too." Daniel smiled softly. "Guess we both found our way back." The CEO extended his hand and Daniel shook it firmly. "Keep playing," the CEO said. "The world needs more people like you." "I will," Daniel promised. When the CEO left, Daniel sat in silence for a while. He thought about everything that had happened, the years of struggle, the moment of courage, the chance that turned into a miracle. It wasn't luck, he realized. It was persistence, love, and the quiet strength that comes from never giving up. As he turned off the lights and walked out of the building,